From Michigan to Nebraska, Missouri to New York, this is American Radio Journal. On this edition, President Trump has proposed a massive new federal program to rebuild the nation's roads and bridges. But is it necessary? Michael Sargent of the Heritage Foundation is here to discuss. On the heels of a budget-busting congressional spending deal, the Trump administration has released its proposed 2019 budget. Rachel Slobodian of the Club for Growth has the real story. Should the government shut down research into robotics and artificial intelligence? One Democratic presidential candidate thinks it should. Eric Boehm gets details from Ron Bailey of Reason magazine. And he is one of the nation's first and most revered African-American leaders. Colin Hanna of Let Freedom Ring USA has an American Radio Journal commentary on the life and times of Frederick Douglass. I'm Loman Henry, and welcome to American Radio Journal. A rare area of agreement among Republicans and Democrats in Washington, D.C. is a desire to spend more on infrastructure, especially roads and bridges. But Michael Sargent says the need has been greatly exaggerated. Michael is a policy analyst with the Thomas A. Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. He's here to talk about the Trump administration's infrastructure initiative. Michael, welcome to American Radio Journal. Michael, before we get into what President Trump is proposing, there has been an ongoing discussion for many years now about the condition of our infrastructure, roads and bridges in particular. The general view is that they're crumbling and in bad shape and are in need of significant investment. Is our infrastructure really in as bad a shape as what it's been made out to be?
I don't think so. I think when you hear about crumbling bridges and the kind of overall notion that our infrastructure is decrepit, I think that's a bit of a mischaracterization. When you actually look at the data about our major infrastructure assets, these are the national highway system that goes across the country, bridges, airports, what you actually see is that they perform fairly well. Of course, they're not perfect, but overall, I think it would be wrong to conclude that they're crumbling. And so if you look at the number of structurally deficient bridges, for instance, that doesn't mean that they're unsafe. It just means they require extensive maintenance. And the number and share of bridges that were deemed structurally deficient has actually declined by half over the last 25 years. And so right now it sits at less than 9% or so of bridges that are structurally deficient. And the same goes for pavement on the national highway system. About 93% of the miles driven on our major highways are on pavement that's in good or satisfactory condition. And then when you look at our airports, they're moving more people than ever before at a better safety record as well. So while there are certainly improvements that can be made across the board, I think it would be wrong to say that our infrastructure is truly falling apart.
When we look at the nation's infrastructure, can you give us just a brief overview, Michael, of how the nation pays for it? What taxes do we pay and how is it administered?
Sure. So I think you need to take a step back, and a lot of people tend to focus on the federal level first, but I think that that's misguided. The federal government actually spends less than 1/4 the total public spending on infrastructure, and that doesn't even include private infrastructure like telecommunications networks and energy infrastructure. So even within that 1/4 or so, most of that is paid for by the users of the system. So everyone pays 18.4 cents per gallon when they fill up their car with gas, or when you hop on a plane, you pay on average about 14% to the federal government for air traffic control and the airport services. And so generally users pay for the federally funded infrastructure, and that tends to be in the best shape. But then when you go even further and look at local and state spending on infrastructure, especially in the local portion, that's where you see more use of general revenues, so things like sales taxes or property taxes paying for the infrastructure. And not surprisingly, those are the assets that tend to be in worse shape than most of the other things. So local roads, in some cases drinking water systems, and as well as mass transit. And so we see things that are not funded out of a user fee type system. Those are the ones that do tend to be in the worst shape, the potholed roads and bridges that I think people generalize too broadly about.
President Trump, over the past week, Michael, tried to put the emphasis on infrastructure. It was supposed to be Infrastructure Week, and As usual, a whole lot of sideshows entered into the picture. But in terms of what the president would like to see have done, what is the White House now proposing?
What we saw from this kind of 55-page document that was released early last week, there are basically two parts to it. The first is a multi-bucket spending program that would spend about $200 billion in federal funds that hopes to incentivize the private sector to invest an additional $1.3 trillion in spending. And so these are basically federal dollars that are going to be distributed on the notion that they will be matched about 80% for the total project cost by state and local governments. So it's kind of a change in the federal government's approach, whereby they're now going to be saying, okay, we're going to spend $200 billion in additional money, but we're not going to be picking up nearly as much of the project share as tends to be historical. So that first spending program is the first part. Then on the other side, there's a huge overhaul in the federal regulatory approach when it comes to infrastructure. And this is, I think, more noteworthy than the spending side, because when you actually look at the way the federal government regulates the infrastructure, you have a whole host of problems ranging from massive project delays stemming from the environmental review and permitting process all the way down to how the federal government essentially continues to regulate the operation of infrastructure well after the federal funds have been expended to complete the construction. So it's kind of a two-pronged approach. Most people are focusing on the $200 billion in spending, but I think the regulatory changes are kind of the more noteworthy aspect that we're seeing, and those will be, if enacted, around for much longer than the amount of money that they're saying they want to spend. So I think you have to focus on both parts.
To sort of take this maybe up to a higher philosophical level for a minute, Michael, is it really advantageous for us to continue infrastructure funding and spending on roads and bridges at the federal level? Or would this be the type of function that might be better devolved to allow states to do directly without funneling money through Washington?
Yeah, I definitely agree with the latter part of that. What we've seen is kind of the federal government initially at least had a sort of a fairly clear federal role when we're building the interstate system. These were the truly trans-nation highways. They crossed multiple states. Since they've been largely completed in the early 90s, the federal government has been much more nebulous in terms of spending money. So, for instance, even though the interstate system's less than 50,000 miles of roadway, over 1 million miles of roadway are now eligible for federal funding. And so we've seen, and of course, when you have this large amount of money available for Congress, they tend to funnel it to all sorts of kind of pork barrel spending back in their districts that helps them get reelected. So I think, by and large, the political incentives would be much better if we allowed the states and localities to manage this and then commensurately reduce federal transportation taxes. Because what we've seen is not only kind of bad practices on the part of Congress in terms of using those resources, but we see perverse incentives for local and state governments whereby they may delay necessary repairs to their infrastructure in hopes of getting a federal grant, or even worse, completely ignore maintenance of existing infrastructure and go to the federal government and try and get a bunch of free money to spend on brand new, shiny projects, which in the long run adds up to a lot of deferred maintenance. And that's part of the problem in terms of what we've seen at the local level when it comes to infrastructure that's in poor shape.
We have been talking with Michael Sargent. Michael is a policy analyst with the Thomas A. Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies, that at the Heritage Foundation. They are based in Washington, D.C. Michael, tell us a bit about the Heritage Foundation and where folks can go to read more about this subject.
Sure. Heritage is a nonprofit think tank located in Washington. We focus on the economic policy side on advancing free market and limited government reforms. And you can read reports on infrastructure as well as a whole host of other issues at heritage.org.
Michael Sargent of the Heritage Foundation. Michael, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
We go now to the offices of the Club for Growth, and this week we are going to talk with Rachel Slobodian, who is the Communications Director at the Club for Growth, filling in for our friend Andy Roth. Rachel, good to have you with us.
Lemon, thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
It's been an interesting week, as most of them tend to be in Washington, D.C., Rachel. The Trump administration has put on the table its budget, proposed budget. Typically, presidential proposed budgets go nowhere, but at least it's a starting point. Can you tell us a little bit about the highlights of what the president is proposing?
On Monday of this week, President Trump unveiled his budget for 2019, and in it we saw lots of spending for national defense. There were some components for eliminating waste, and I think one of the most important or best components was that it includes proposals for much-needed entitlement and welfare reform.
As we look at that budget, does it also include the massive increase in spending that was agreed to a couple of weeks ago? And perhaps you might even want to touch upon to refresh our listeners' memories as to what happened the week before.
What happened a week before was really no good for America, and unfortunately was something that Leader McConnell in the Senate and Chuck Schumer, the Democrat leader in the Senate, came up with, and that's what they termed the Bipartisan Budget Act. But really what it is it was 700 pages long. It was passed within 30 hours of being brought to the floor. It suspended the debt ceiling until after the midterm elections, and I think one of the most difficult components to stomach about it is that it's 3 times larger spending increases than any that we saw under Obama. So when you think about Congress passed that on Friday, and then we have the President Trump's budget on Monday, it really made the president's budget little less to stomach because Congress had already acted on their own and acted in a lot of ways to harm the American people.
As we look at what the regular process is, which we haven't seen in, over a decade, in terms of how the budget's passed, there should be, by the 1st of October, a federal budget in place. We haven't had that. We've had a lot of continuing resolutions. So where does this put us now in terms of process, Rachel? We have this bipartisan budget deal supposed to go for 2 years, yet the president's now put on the table a budget for 2019. Are we going to actually go back to some sort of a regular order here, or is this going to be a continued resolution situation?
Yes, I absolutely think it's the latter. I don't think we should count on a regular order coming anytime soon, particularly when you look at the fact that we have the midterms coming up. That's never a time when you see Congress functioning at its highest. Instead, they're very frantically concerned about re-election. So a lot of people noted in the media that the legislation that was passed last week is ultimately probably like the biggest thing that they're going to pass until a new Congress comes in, and that's terrifying.
So we're going to enter into the 2018 midterm elections against this fiscal backdrop. We have the primary season about to start. There's a primary coming up here in a couple of weeks in Arizona. Actually, that's a special election, isn't it?
It is. Yes, it is. It'll be for the seat that Trent Franks is vacating.
But in early March 6th to be exact, the Lone Star State of Texas is going to hold its primary. Can you give us some highlights of what we can expect in Texas in their primary in March?
Yes, so we have some great candidates in Texas, and they are in retiring seats. So the first one is Van Taylor, who is running for the seat that's left open by Sam Johnson, who's been in Congress for a very, very long time. I almost want to say longer than I've been alive. And so it's an opportunity to get a great conservative, and Van is running a very strong race, and we endorsed him early on. The second one that I would point to is in Texas 21. It's the seat that's currently held by Lamar Smith, and he announced that he was not running for re-election. That race is a very competitive primary because it's a very crowded field, but Club for Growth PAC has endorsed a candidate there, Chip Roy, who is an incredible conservative. He has worked for Rick Perry and Ted Cruz and has served as a U.S. attorney, and he has just an incredible resume. I think one of the greatest achievements that he did was fighting against Obamacare, and he fought tooth and nail, and we couldn't be more excited to endorse him and really look forward to him securing victory come March 6th. And then ultimately, because the field is so crowded, the primary field is so crowded, it will likely go into a runoff, but we're confident that Chip Roy will win.
Speaking of our friend Ted Cruz, he's up for re-election this year, but no primary battle for the senator?
He is, and he is up for re-election, but he has such a strong campaigner and has done so much for the state of Texas. And the great part about Ted Cruz is that all the voters in Texas should know exactly where he stands on the issues. And it's great to have a man like that in Congress.
Yeah, you rarely wonder where Ted stands. He's usually pretty good about letting you know that. So we'll keep an eye on that with Senator Cruz. The general election's going to be more the issue there. We'll keep a close eye on that as we head into the fall. One final quick note here, Rachel. Coming up on the 13th of March, a more competitive special election, this in Pennsylvania. What's going on there?
That race is between Rick Saccone and then just a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat, Connor Lamb, who has made very clear that he will stand in lockstep with what would become Speaker Nancy Pelosi if the Democrats win in 2018, and where you have a great conservative state legislature in Rick Saccone. So that's another race that we've endorsed. And in fact, Club for Growth PAC also started running radio ads this week, and we'll have them up through the election. So be on the lookout for those.
And, of course, that district that Rick Saccone and Connor Lamb are running in went heavily for Donald Trump in 2016. So we will keep an eye on that. It could be a bellwether district. But we will, as always, be keeping an eye on all of these primary elections as the primary election season all across the country is about to get underway. We have been talking with Rachel Slobodian, who is the Communications Director of the Club for Growth. Rachel, tell us just a little bit about the Club for Growth and also your website.
Our website is clubforgrowth.org. That's for spelled out SOR. And we are a national network of pro-growth and limited government conservatives that advocate for prosperity and opportunity coming through economic freedom. So I'd encourage everyone to go to our website, check it out. We engage in policy battles on Capitol Hill, as well as our Super PAC arm that is active in many campaigns. So there you can see all of the candidates that we've endorsed, those that we've identified as true pro-growth conservatives, and then you can also join, and joining is just for free. Rachel
Slobodian of the Club for Growth. Rachel, thank you for being here.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
Does artificial intelligence pose a risk to society? Eric Boehm and Ron Bailey of Reason Magazine look at the views of one presidential candidate who thinks it does. Eric?
A potential Democratic presidential candidate in 2020 says he wants to put humanity first, and that means the government might have to step in to deal with innovations like self-driving cars, AI, and robots possibly replacing human workers. But technology has always made humanity better off, not the other way around, and we shouldn't necessarily be scared of new cutting-edge developments. Hi, folks. I'm Eric Boehm with Reason Magazine. Thanks for joining us on this edition of American Radio Journal. My guest today is Ron Bailey. He is the science correspondent for Reason Magazine and Reason.com, and he's also the author of The End of Doom, Environmental Renewal in the 21st Century, an excellent book on environmental politics. You can find that on Amazon and elsewhere. Ron, thanks for taking some time and joining us here on the program.
I'm delighted to be with you again.
So this is Andrew Yang. He is a tech entrepreneur, and he is supposedly, the New York Times says, flirting with the idea of running for president in 2020. And he's got some ideas, Ron, about what the government should do. I guess if he's going to be president, that means what he would like to do in terms of dealing with technology like self-driving cars and advanced robotics, AI. He says these things could destabilize society.
That's right. His slogan is "Put humanity first," and his idea is that no robots need apply. So he's very concerned that automation and evolving artificial intelligence is going to cause a high unemployment very soon. In fact, he's citing a report by the McKinsey & Company consultancy that projected a possibility that robots would take away 70 million American jobs by 2030, which is, of course, not that far away.
And, as political slogans go, put humanity first isn't really that terrible. It rolls off the tongue. It sticks in the mind. Make America great again. Put humanity first. I guess it's almost about bringing us together against this, the threat of the robot menace or something like that, Ron. Look, this is a new twist on a very old debate. This is a debate that's been going on in politics for well over 100 years. You go all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, right? And there's been this fear amongst politicians that new technology is going to disrupt society, is going to put workers out of their jobs. It's going to be the doom of humanity, whatever. That's never never happened before, but what does the history tell us? What does the research suggest? How scared should we be? How much should the government be concerned about cutting-edge AI or robotics and the effect they could have on the workforce?
Well, as you point out, this has been a concern that rises periodically over time. And what has actually happened is that as we automate more and more tasks, we find that human labor becomes more expensive over time. That is, people start demanding more workers and more productivity from workers over time. So there is basically technological unemployment is a myth. It isn't the case. And I suspect that these tendencies will continue throughout most of the 21st century. Humanity will always be first. The robots will be our servants, and they will make us more productive over time rather than less. And we'll all get richer.
Yeah, and I think the really exciting thing about the robot revolution, if such a thing happens, is the potential for the cost of goods and labor to get a lot cheaper than they are now. I mean, you'll be able to afford things made by robotic labor that you can't afford to have made by humans. That's good for everybody. It's especially good for people on the lower end of the income spectrum, Ron. Let's go back to Andrew Yang for a second here, though. Now, his idea is that the government is going to have to pay people because the robots are going to come and take all our jobs and nobody's going to work anymore. And so that means, you've got to get money to pay for things somehow. So the government will have to somehow pay people because the robots took their jobs.
Right. And he has a book called The War on Normal People, The Truth About America's Disappearing Jobs and Why Universal Basic Income is Our Future. And that's what he wants to do, is establish a universal basic income. He would give every American $1,000 per month in what he calls a freedom dividend, and everybody between ages 18 and 64 would be given that money. And that would just be shy of $3 trillion annually. And he basically thinks that is how you keep people from rioting in the streets as their jobs are taken away by the evil robots.
We're talking with Ron Bailey. He's Reason Magazine science correspondent. Ron, there's something about this idea that Andrew Yang has that I think does connect with people, and that is this fear of social upheaval, because we can go back through history and we can look at times where there was rapid change in technology. And even though as a whole we've all come out of it better off because of that, I mean, there is disruption that happens, good and bad disruption, and that does create problems for real people, and he's talking about that in this book that you talk about, and potentially, if he runs for president, he'll certainly talk about this as well. How worried should we be about that, or what is the right way, I guess, to approach? That's a very real practical concern, I think, for a lot of Americans.
Well, I actually think that the guy named Sebastian Thrun, who is the co-founder of Google X Lab and the CEO of the online education Udacity, basically points out what's likely to happen is that as robotics develop over time, artificial intelligence develop over time, essentially we will be using them as tools to make ourselves more productive over time. And the way he puts it, a very catchy way he puts it, is that artificial intelligence is going to turn us into superhumans. It will take our brains and put them on steroids and will free humanity from the slavery of repetitive work and replace it with highly creative work. And I actually think he's right.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to be a superhuman. That sounds pretty good to me. And if I could get a robot to take care of all the chores around the house and maybe have cheaper goods and services to buy, that would all be pretty good too, Ron. I think, the potential there, certainly for a lot of upheaval in the next couple of decades. But I think policymakers have to resist the urge to be too aggressive in responding to it. This is something that, like throughout history, will work itself out, and we will all come out of it happier and healthier and richer because of it. So that's unfortunately all the time that we have for today. That's Ron Bailey. He's the science correspondent for Reason Magazine. Ron, thanks for joining us on the show.
Delighted to be with you again.
And you can check out Ron's work on robots and environmental policy and everything in between at Reason.com. Also check out his book, The End of Doom, Environmental Renewal in the 21st Century. For Reason Magazine, I'm Eric Boehm. Thanks for joining us, folks, and we will catch you right back here again next week on another edition of American Radio Journal.
A new film is under production documenting the life of Frederick Douglass. Colin Hanna of Let Freedom Ring USA talks about it on this American Radio Journal commentary.
Earlier this week, the nation celebrated the bicentennial of the birth of Frederick Douglass, born into slavery near St. Michael's, Maryland, in February of 1818. He was an amazing man with a story that is little known today by the average person who is not a history buff. He is the subject of a forthcoming feature film from Enduring Impact Productions. The title of the film is simply Mr. Douglass, but that short name conveys a lot. As a slave, he was always referred to by his first name, Fred or Freddie, never by his last name, which was Bailey, not Douglas. Some years after he changed his name to Douglas, he was greeted by Abraham Lincoln in the White House as Mr. Douglas. Thus, that name conveys his journey from slave to citizen, and not just any citizen, but one who rose to the very heights of American civic life. One little-known fact that symbolizes this remarkable journey is that Frederick Douglass was the most photographed person in all of 19th century America, even more than President Lincoln. His story is the story of America. It is one of unimaginably humble, even dehumanized origin, followed by courage, self-education, striving for excellence, achievement, and, finally, international recognition. His story is also a contrast to today's Black Lives Matter movement. While that movement has what many see as an anti-American element within its criticism of racism, Frederick Douglass fought against racism while loving America. He especially revered our Declaration of Independence and Constitution. He was also a complex man, and 4 quick points of contrast capture some of that complexity. Republicans claim him as one of their own because he was a proud Republican. One of his most famous sayings was, "I am a Republican, a black, dyed-in-the-wool Republican, and I shall never be a member of any party other than the Party of Freedom." But Democrats also claim Douglass as one of their own because they see him as the father of the civil rights movement, notwithstanding the fact that for nearly 100 years theirs was the party of racial discrimination, lynchings, and the Ku Klux Klan. We Christians claim Douglass as one of our own because he was indeed a believer in God and the authority of the Bible and accepted Jesus Christ as his Savior. He was even a licensed preacher in the AME Zion denomination. But non-believers and agnostics also claim him as one of their own because he was so critical of the hypocrisy of the church of his day. Can you think of another person in American history who can be claimed as one of their own by Republicans, Democrats, Christians, and non-believers? I have read the script for Mr. Douglass, and it is not a Christian film per se. It is a general audience film with a profoundly Christian theme. Nor is it a conservative film. It is a general audience film that presents profoundly conservative values. It is not a patriotic film that glosses over the dark spots of our history. It is a general audience film that promotes patriotism through Douglass's unshakable love of our country. It is a film with a scene of redemption that may bring you to tears as it did me. It is a film that will promote racial reconciliation. It is a film that will inspire audiences to rededicate themselves to our highest ideals by rediscovering one of our greatest heroes. If you, as listeners to American Radio Journal, would like to read a copy of the script, go to the Let Freedom Ring website and click on the Contact tab and leave your email address and say, "Script for Mr. Douglass" in the comment field. The Let Freedom Ring website is letfreedomringusa.com. That's letfreedomringusa.com. This has been Colin Hanna of Let Freedom Ring USA for American Radio Journal.
American Radio Journal is heard on public affairs-minded radio stations all across the country, including our newest affiliate, WYTK-FM in Florence, Alabama. Welcome to our new listeners in the Yellowhammer State. American Radio Journal is produced weekly by the Lincoln Institute of Public Opinion Research, Incorporated. The Lincoln Institute is completely funded through the generosity of individuals, corporations, and philanthropic foundations which underwrite the costs of this program. Comments and opinions expressed on this program are those of the guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Lincoln Institute or of this radio station. Learn more about American Radio Journal and hear expanded versions of some interviews aired on our program. Please visit our website, AmericanRadioJournal.com. I'm Loman Henry. Thank you for listening to American Radio Journal. American Radio Journal, lighting the brush fires of freedom.